So Alex, what inspired you to start Hookdeck, and tell me what problems is it solving?
Yeah, that goes back to a couple of years ago. I was working as the CTO for this e-commerce business. At the time, Shopify wasn't what it is today, and so we built a bunch of custom software to operate the company. We had our own subscription management that was built on Stripe. We had our e-commerce, but also fulfillment software and all that. And as I was building this, like obviously Webhooks was just like a massive part of it. And on one side of things, like I was trying to, it was a women fashion business, so I was trying to sell like skirts and oisery and nylons and stuff. And then I was dealing with kind of like Webhook issues all day. So I figured like something was kind of wrong, just like in the priority stack, right? And there really wasn't any kind of generic solution to address this problem. And so the inception story very much like is the prototypical I have an issue, kind of like basement project type thing. In the early days, I kind of just like put a Medium post out there saying something around like Webhooks sucks, but there's something you can do about it, right? Like this kind of very opinionated piece about it. And I actually remember in there, I was using Stripe as kind of like the gold standard. And I was saying like, look at all those things that like Stripe is doing so well. But then pointing at like what Shopify and Intercom and Twilio and so on like wasn't. And so I was like kind of pointing fingers a little bit, but I think it caught kind of like just organic interest by people relating with the problem. And so that's very much kind of like the inception story of Hookdeck. A lot has changed since then. Like we figured out just like a ton in the last 5 years. But what Hookdeck is today is an event gateway. So think of it as a new cloud infrastructure primitive, similar to what an API gateway is, but for asynchronous event-driven problem. And so the event gateway is kind of like solving three big pieces of the puzzle. It's solving the interoperability. And so that's the ability of receiving events from all the providers that you work with, dealing with filtering, routing, verification, authentication, and all that. That's kind of like the first component. The second component is the queuing and the throughput management. And so the event gateway is responsible for doing all the queuing and the asynchronous processing and state management associated with each of the events and the webhooks that you receive. The last part is the event log. And so it's a centralized way of seeing all the webhooks you receive across all your providers, being able to sort through it, search through it, and also replay, which has been very important functionality.
That's funny. I also but like 15, 20 years ago, working for a company that they amalgamated lots of different fashion websites as like an aggregator.
Yeah.
And so I ended up learning like the difference between a pencil skirt and a dupe dress or whatever.
Yeah, it's the type of thing that you never thought you would learn about. Yeah. I was deep in the materials for nylons and stuff, and so yeah, I can totally relate.
It's funny how you go down like just problem solving for different things. So so there's a few things there that you mentioned. I want to unpick it a little bit. The first thing was that you said you were solving, one of the things you're solving is the interoperability from having lots of different event producers that you have to consume. Why is that a problem? What's difficult about that?
Yeah, I think like what you realize very quickly as you kind of build software in 2025, right, is you integrate with all those different providers that are doing some form of function for your business, your software, your app, like whatever, right? And each one are going to have inconsistencies around specifically how they do webhook delivery. And so that might be around timeout. And so, for instance, Twilio has very tight timeouts. Shopify are a little bit more lax in their timeouts, but they're inconsistent across the board. It's also going to be around security and authentication using different signatures and strategies. Some will do handshakes, for instance, to validate that you own the URLs. Others won't. Around the payload and the payload format. For instance, Wix will send the payloads in JWT encoded tokens, while Stripe will send them as JSON, and GitHub will send them as URL form encoded, right? And so there's all sorts of inconsistencies. But the thing that is important to understand is like from a developer standpoint that is integrating, let's say with Stripe, like earlier I was saying how Stripe was kind of like my reference at least 5 years ago, right? Is that they don't just have to integrate with Stripe, right? And so the architectural and developer concerns that you have has to be for all of the worst parts of each one of your provider, right? And so like one provider might have very tight timeout, which now means you need to respond quickly effectively, your architecture at least needs to be capable of responding quickly across the board. Or one might not have an event log that you can replay, and so now you need to start storing these, and now you have disparate place where some of your webhook history is going to be in Stripe, some of your webhook history is going to be in PayPal, and some other webhook history might be in some ad hoc system that you put together because the provider doesn't have a webhook history, and so on, right? And so ultimately, you have to like kind of build for the weakest link in the chain, so to speak. And all your considerations have to be around those like constraints that the different providers are going to have.
I love it. I think that's something that we forget about at Stripe a lot, is that people are not just building with Stripe, right? They build an application, they use Stripe to move money around, and they use all those different other providers for lots of other different things that they need to fill those holes with. So I understand the interoperability problem. I also love the idea that you can just integrate with Hookdeck and then configure Hookdeck to receive all the events from all these different service providers, right?
Yeah.
And then Hookdeck kind of creates a standard that you can then interact with. Is this how it works?
In Hookdeck itself, you can set your own rules.
Right.
And so you can say, this is my retry logic, right? And that retry logic can be global to kind of everything, all the events that flow through Hookdeck, but it can also be on a per use case basis. And so like one thing, for instance, with Stripe is that their retry logic is fixed regardless of why it failed or what the event is about and so on, right? While in Hookdeck, you can say, well, listen, if the status code is a 400 or 4XX, I don't want to retry that because that means there was some kind of payload structure error. In which case some engineer is going to have a look at it anyway, so it's kind of pointless to retry. While if it's a 5XX, then I know there was some kind of like downstream issue on my server, and so therefore I only want to retry in those cases, right? And so you can like go in and set the granularity in terms of per use case, per payload, and so on, rather than being like stuck on like specifically set kind of like generically defined rules like that, right? And coming back to the point that you're saying about Stripe, I've been like talking with the Stripe team and PM kind of working on this, and I think like it's one of their big kind of conclusion as well from those conversations. But specifically, Stripe is the most installed event source across Hookdeck, but it's only about third in terms of event volume. And the reason for that is because we see pretty much every single business use Stripe, right? It doesn't mean that they're getting a lot of volume from Stripe because it might just be subscription from their own business that they're getting, for instance, right? And so what you realize is that nearly everyone integrates Stripe in some fashion, but then it's rarely like the core of their business, right? While there's others which are building, for instance, Stripe apps, which the core of their business is built on getting that data from Stripe. And so there's very like kind of disparate use cases like that.
Yeah, so there's applications that are built into Stripe that people offer, and then there's applications that use Stripe to move money around, and then they sort of set and forget it and move on.
Exactly, yeah. But at the end of the day, almost everyone receives webhooks from Stripe in one way or another.
Right. So I noticed you've been talking about webhooks and events kind of at the, almost like they're the same thing. Are they the same thing? Is there a difference? How would you distinguish between these two ways of describing what you do, events and webhooks?
I think that is like so foundational to how you think about webhooks. And maybe it's pedantic to get caught in definitions or whatever. But webhooks, I think historically people kind of like think of as HTTP post requests with HMAX signatures that you send to some like public URL on your server and so on. But I would argue that webhook really only describe kind of like the set of generic expectations that you have around like the delivery of that event. But the webhook really represents the event, and the webhook itself is the delivery mechanism of that event. And I think like the Stripe team actually thinks very similarly because you just released event destinations, which went GA a couple of months ago. And so even now in the Stripe dashboard, when you go to create a webhook, you no longer create a webhook, you create an event destination with the delivery type of webhook, right?
I think actually we got it wrong. In my opinion, I think we got it wrong the first time round. When we created this webhook, and you would go into the link was webhooks, and then in webhooks you could create a destination with AWS, right?
Yeah.
And I think now they've kind of helped to solve that by recategorizing a webhook endpoint as an event destination.
Totally, and I think the industry is moving in that direction. I think a lot of the issues that are associated with webhooks aren't strictly related to the fact they're webhooks. They're more closely related to the fact that they're events that you need to handle asynchronously and kind of like the asynchronous programming paradigms that come along with that. so that's really the case, and you can kind of like see this movement in the industry, and like Stripe is not the only one in that situation. For instance, Shopify to this day, you still register webhooks with them, although those webhooks can go to GCP PubSub or EventBridge, and they've built kind of like arbitrary URI that you use as the webhook URL. And so I think like multiple other teams are kind of realizing that this like definition for like webhooks and the construct that we've had over like, let's call it 10 years, isn't really the right definition and the one that's like future proof, right? And like Stripe is kind of leading the charge and changing that definition, and we're trying to play our role as well with the Event Destination Initiative, but maybe that's a conversation for another day.
Well, it feels like there's been a bit of acceleration in people building with event-driven architecture in the last 3 or 4 years, right? Like not a lot happened. We were talking about this before we started shooting. There wasn't a lot of change in event-driven applications for a long time. And now there seems to be more and more people coming up with event-driven architecture. Why do you think that is?
I think there's kind of 2 main answers to that. Well, let's call it 3 main answers to that. First, there's just like the slow burn of adoption, right? Like more and more producers will support event-driven architectures or will push for it. And so there's the slow burn of the adoption of people migrating old system, building new applications and new products that are kind of using like the more modern approach and are moving away from polling based to push based, which kind of webhooks serve, right? Second is like specific industries hadn't really modernized around that. I'm always like shocked. Like for instance, one place where Hookdeck is having a lot of traction is in the shipping and kind of like 3PL area. And a lot of those companies just haven't moved to event-based architecture for mainly legacy reasons, and now are starting to do so, right? And so in the last like 3 or 4 years, we've had some of like the biggest shipping company in Australia, for instance, starting to use Hookdeck because they're doing that transition from synchronous to asynchronous. And the third one is a little bit the trend that we're seeing around AI as well. Because one thing that we notice is a lot of agents are, yes, like triggered by you just going in ChatGPT or whatever your LLM of choice of the day and typing some message to it. But really, we're moving toward an agentic world, and agents are triggered by some externality. And so very commonly, for instance, you might want to run some model whenever there's a new PR in GitHub, right? And so now that means you introduce that dependency on the event coming from like a new open PR in GitHub. And so we're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of adoption around companies building around AIs or trying to incorporate both data that is coming from platform and from webhook or event streams into that data, or also running agents off of that.
How do you see the kind of infrastructure of webhooks as they evolve along with AI systems then?
Well, I think talking about infrastructure for a webhook is really talking about interoperable event-driven architecture. And so really we're kind of internalizing the fact that we've been building webhooks and applications that integrate together. We've building event-driven architectures, but both have made the assumptions that either happens mostly within their own bubble. And so the event-driven architecture that you've built historically was mostly like publishers and consumers within your own infrastructure. And most software, as they were built, they weren't necessarily built for those external integrations that are going to interact with it, right? And now there's like kind of the bridging of those two bubbles. And in the Venn diagram, you realize that like, okay, well, now we're building event-driven architectures where you don't necessarily control the consumer or the producers, right? And I think the architectural constraints now that we're dealing with has to do with that overlap in interoperability, right?
Yeah.
And so that's like the problem that we've really been focused on.
Incidentally, I think that's the same reason why you've seen the sort of growth in EDA over the last 5 to 6, 7 years. It's because people are using managed services a lot more, and they need to link these things up, and they link them up with webhooks and events, right?
Yeah, totally. And I've been calling webhooks the gateway drug to event-driven architecture because I think for a lot of people that are not working in like really big companies that have been adopters of event-driven architectures for a long time, their first exposure is through webhooks, right? And so for most engineer, most company at kind of like the small, mid-sized, medium, large like companies, haven't really had to deal with event-driven architectures and asynchronous programming paradigm until they have to deal with webhooks. And so in some ways, like once you learn those paradigm and you learn the gotchas and the issues and how to design around it, then that also becomes like a very interesting design pattern at large for your architecture and how you build software, right? And so I think that's what's driven the adoption in event-driven architecture. Although I will say I have a little bit of, I don't know if it's a gripe, but if you look at the Google trend for event-driven architecture, it's looking pretty darn flat. And so it seems like people are looking for message bus and message queues and webhooks and like adjacent keywords. I don't know if like event-driven
the category
architecture,
needs to get wider.
I don't know if that specific set of words is actually drawing a lot of attention right now.
So one of the paradigm shifts, or one of the difficult things you mentioned, like asynchronous applications. Another one is testing locally and how you go from sort of local to staging to production, QA, whatever. How does Hookdeck help you with testing locally when you're integrating lots of different SaaS providers?
Yeah, so I want to speak to how this was done for the last 10 years.
Okay.
Right. So the way this works, depending on how frugal you were probably using ngrok or maybe Cloudflare tunnels or something along those lines. And depending on whether or not you're a paid user, you either had kind of like fixed URL that you were paying for, or more likely you weren't paying for it. And then every single time that you started ngrok, you'd get a different URL that you would use as kind of like a tunnel to bridge between your local host and whatever the service provider you're integrating with, right? And one thing that we see, like for instance with Stripe, is then people will have like a bunch of those URLs that they'll try to manage, and then they'll run into limitations where in Stripe, for instance, you can't have more, I can't remember the specific number, but let's call it like 20 webhooks, but you have a team of 25 engineers, and now what do you do with the other 5, right? And all those limitations and constraints are coming from the fact that tunneling tools weren't built for this. They were built as a bidirectional one-to-one peering system between some URL and your local server, right? But webhooks are asynchronous, and that means we can leverage that to build a much better developer experience locally. And that's what we've done through the Hookdeck CLI. And so the way that the Hookdeck CLI works, it's very similar, reminiscent to ngrok, but the difference is that it's asynchronous, and we don't need to have this one-to-one relationship to kind of like URL computer. And so what that means is any number of engineers can connect on the same URL at the same time, and Hookdeck can determine how many CLIs are connected and create a copy of the event that then gets sent to every one of the connected clients, right? And so you can have multiple teams working on the same event stream at the same time on the same URL without having to like manage and go update the URL and coordinate around like who's using it at one time and at what time and so on, right? And once you start thinking about it in terms of like, okay, what is the developer experience for people that are specifically building for that use cases, then there's also other ideas that come up. And so for instance, we have like bookmarking features. And so you can take historical data, either from your production data or your test data, bookmark it a little bit to kind of like how you would build a Postman like collection, for instance. And then you can replay it at a later time, either in your CI/CD, as part of your development process and so on, and engineers can have kind of like a library of all the different events. And
so that means you can bookmark or save certain events.
Correct.
And replay them.
Yes.
It's very helpful.
And it's shared across the whole team, right?
Yeah.
And then you can have metadata associated with it. So like for instance,
right.
This is a Stripe invoice greater than $100, which we're supposed to do something special with, for instance, right? Or this is a subscription for like a VIP customer, which we also have a special edge case in our code with. And so you can encode all those things that are like much more specific than kind of like what you'd get from the Stripe CLI, right? Like the Stripe CLI will just kind of like generate a generic payload, but you don't get to say like, oh, well, in that payload, I'm interested in invoices of this amount with this specific product in it. And then maybe if there's a discount, I do something different, and all those sorts of like different edge cases, right?
Yeah. So how many events do you process on Hookdeck?
Yeah, we're in the billions.
Billions.
we don't make the number public.
Okay.
I think in the slides for tonight I say that we've processed over 100 billion webhooks. So
since you started?
yes.
Wow.
Well,
So,
obviously there's a growth curve, and so
Sure.
the bulk of that is in very recent days.
So do you have any kind of advice or stories for how you build an infrastructure that can handle billions of events? Like, there must have been some learning along the way there.
Yeah, so I think there's like kind of two core concepts that are really important to understand when you're building for that sort of scale. Some are more kind of like the event-driven nature concept. And so one thing I'm always kind of like surprised is just how widely misunderstood the concept of independency is. One of the big constraints when you're building event-driven architectures and building with webhooks is that you don't get to choose if something is going to be independent or not. Everything has to be independent. And so that means everything that you do downstream from processing an event needs to take that into account. And I think when you're operating at small scale, the small odds of a redelivery, for instance, of a webhook, they maybe don't like compound or add up, right? But if you get a 0.01 redelivery rate, but you're processing billions of webhooks, like suddenly now you actually get a lot of issues out of it, right?
Sure, yeah.
So that's kind of like more on the application design, system design side of things. And then from the architecture standpoint, you basically need to completely forego synchronous processing. There's no way that you can operate at that scale with unpredictable volume synchronously, or at least probably not for a long time. And so that means you need to adopt queues in your system. You need to build for scalable architecture, but also deferred processing. And that opens up a whole different can of worms around how you manage throughput and back pressure in your queues, and so on, because there's a lot of kind of like tooling that comes around that, like dealing with what do you do when the webhook throughput is higher than what you can handle? How do you respond to that from kind of like a incident standpoint, or if it's even considered an incident at your company? What are the knobs that you have to be able to increase capacity? What are you willing to trade off on in terms of the latency and the delay of processing? And so those are all kind of like the concern that you start weighing. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unpack there.
Sure. So what's next for Hookdeck? What are some of the problems that you're most excited about solving?
Well, I think as an industry, there's a lot changing right now. For the last 10 years, we kind of like touched on this a little bit, but like over the last 10 years, there's been very little change in terms of the expectations around webhooks. Now there's a lot changing. Stripe announced 10 events very recently because they were just, at least the way I read it, Stripe is acknowledging that a lot of problems around ordering and so on are complex enough that people would rather just like refresh the data from the API, and so they get a reference through webhook, go fetch the latest data, and just act from the latest data. So that's an example. But I think more importantly, there's Stripe releasing event destinations and going GA with it. Our own initiative that we started around the event destination initiative. Just 2 months ago, we released a new open source product, which is
yeah, that looks great.
Yeah, it's basically a open source implementation of Stripe event destinations. Although we support a lot more destinations than you do. And so Outpost today already supports, I think, 6 or 7 different destination types.
Awesome.
And so we're very bullish in terms of the industry moving that direction and the adoption of event destination as a concept. We want to play a part in that through the open source project and through the event destination initiative. And lastly, we're building an event destination, right? We're building Hookdeck, the event gateway. And I think we're very much just at the start of that. And so AWS kind of like led the way with AWS Event Bridge. But I think there's been very little innovation there. And now we're bringing some innovation, and competitors are releasing products around that as well. And so I think it took mostly 4 years to establish the basics. And now is when it gets really interesting, right? Like now is when the industry is starting to change and there's new ways of thinking about things and we're bringing new solutions to developers.
Do you think you'll get to the point where you're adding a possibility to sort of add compute to the event before you then publish it out?
That has been internal debate since almost day one.
Really?
And so Hookdeck today supports transformations.
Mm-hmm.
There are pure functions right now, and so that means there's no I/O. You can do API calls from those transformations and so on. And they're used to like change content type.
Use like JSON-ada or something like that?
No, it's just JavaScript, and so we're running isolate VMs of JavaScript functions that user write. They kind of serve as post-processing functions or middlewares on those webhooks.
And then can you like share with each other different JavaScript functions that help transfer? Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so people use it, for instance, to like standardize payload, and so they might get webhooks from PayPal and from Stripe or Checkout.com or whatever, and then standardize that into like a single invoice definition, for instance.
So do you have a kind of repo where people can share their transformations?
Not right now. It's like shared within your own organization, but
right.
like we don't have like a public like repository. Although that's a great idea.
Great idea, yeah.
And so maybe you can count that as compute, but I think like one line that we've drawn at least so far is that the event gateway is not where your business logic lives.
Exactly.
It's where your event routing and processing guarantee lives, but the actual business logic is kind of like the consumer from the gateway, right? And so that might be your API or, there's people also, we're seeing a lot of growth in like NA10 and like that sort of tools as well. But we see a clear distinction between kind of like event management and the concerns around event processing guarantees and your business logic itself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. You might as well become a real expert in one particular domain.
Yeah.
It would be very tempting to keep branching out into...
Look, we already have like 4 products, gotta draw a line somewhere.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Alex, thanks so much for coming in to chat. It's been a really informative and enjoyable conversation, and I'll make sure we share your talk later on tonight in the description below.
That's awesome.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Ben.